Okay, so thank you for coming. So today, we'll talk about, an initiative to develop a community-driven standard for open source software quality. Myself, I'm Gabriele Paoloni. I'm a senior principal engineer at Etas, and I'm the chairman of the governing board of the ELISA project. And here we have Philipp.
Yes, I'm a senior community manager at Etas and open source process lead. And I'm the technical steering committee chair of ELISA. And originally, we started the idea of this presentation or this topic on the open standard in ELISA, but we wanted to have a wider outreach because it's not about the safety critical community as such, but on general best practices. And that's why we submitted something and prepared a survey, which you will hear about in the next minutes.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so some introduction. Now, the idea of this, open source good practices, this is something that we started more than a year ago. So during, we had a workshop, an ELISA workshop, it was in Lund. And prior to that, in ELISA, within the ELISA project, we tried to reverse engineer evidences from the Linux development process according to part 6 of ISO 26262. And indeed, we kind of failed, right? And, while we were there, we thought, hey, hold on a sec. So at the end of the day, every single software quality standard today is based on the V model, right? And actually, open source projects, they don't really follow the V model, right? They're not requirement-driven, strictly speaking. They are, they're code-centric, and the code is not frozen. It is, a continuously evolving baseline. And, so probably, there is something, that we need to change. On the other side, today, SPICE and CMMI that are all based on the V model, by the way, are, probably the most common, quality standard for automotive. And every safety standard, or at least ISO 26262 Part 2, require, a baseline of QMS, if you want to make a safety claim on top. And we thought maybe there is a gap that we need to fill within, within the quality standards. We need probably a new quality standard that would be suitable for open source projects. So, yeah, what do? We propose a new standard, or, this is the, the idea. So, and so we, then after this, what we did is, we did a sort of press release where, we also started a survey that Philipp, will present later on during this presentation. And indeed, the goal of this, in this press release, we presented this project. And the goal of this project is to evaluate and document established open source development best practices and, to provide an assessment framework for a user to rate the quality of any open source project, right? Because indeed, open source per se doesn't mean anything from a quality point of view. Open source means that a project is open, but maybe tonight I write some code, I make it open. What's the quality of that? 0, probably, right? It could be like really bad. On the other side, there could be instead, there are many projects that are, that have a great visibility, great adoption, that are very, very mature, right? So I can mention many, like glibc, Linux kernel, Zephyr, Zen, whatever, right? So we need such a framework, or at least this is the goal of this project. And so what we did here, we have defined, the different phases. For this project, the first one is the determination of where we are, the status quo, and then, the definition of practices and associated KPIs, and, assessment of pilot projects according to these practices. In terms of contribution, we expect, people from academia, public sector, open source community, and different industries, indeed, like safety critical or at least like mission critical industries, medical, robotics, avionic, automotive, railway. And then, another aspect to be considered is the funding. This is something that we have not really touched yet. I mean, when it's about money, it's obviously the most difficult part, right? So, and indeed, if you want, reach out to us, and I think we are going to have soon a mailing list.
Yes.
And later I will show you the Git repo where we are collaborating, and now I will pass the, what's the name of this? Whatever.
Clicker. The clicker.
So I'll pass it on to Philipp for the survey results.
Yeah, so we explicitly had the survey under the hood of the Linux Foundation, so not as an ELISA project, as we wanted to have a wider outreach. We didn't want to go simply in our mainly driven automotive domain. We wanted to have more industries involved and so on, and what was the first key insight is, well, 50% of the responses were from automotive. So the other thing is that we also got other responses from academia, public sector, so but the majority at least comes from industry, which is kind of logical because it's like a quality standard. It's not directly touching so much with communities. What was nice to see were the range for robotics, aerospace, industrial, that we also have certain responses there. And you could even also see from individual survey responses that there were people from medical or other parts were really like pointing to the point where they use these kind of things. What is very nice to see is that those which are responding, most likely that's the reason why they are subscribing and seeing Linux Foundation things, they have extensive usage in open source. And it already starts differing if you see how it's with the quality management system. So there it's more like still a minority of 40% who have extensive usage in quality management system, but then we have more distribution going down. Nevertheless, let's say like 60%, 60% that it's extremely relevant for them, and maybe again, it's a survey and you take the survey because you're interested in it, so you need to take it with a grain of salt. But we had a little trick and a cheating thing in there. The idea was to just get input, see it there, and also to attract people working with us. And for this, we put in questions and to see like, how much are you willing to engage? And a lot of responses just say like, most ones, 83%, they would like to participate in meetings, in workshops. Even more were on the providing feedback of the proposed standard side was 90% of also, so it's like there is an interest in there and also willingness to evaluate the result which is coming out. But in order to get the results, you need people who are also actively engaging. And I was super happy to see that like 50% of those who are responded really said we would like to participate and work actively in the working group. And at least out of these, we got 20 plus responses on the first meeting poll because we got the mailing address from the people, so we did an anonymous mail, promoted this a little bit also in social media. So we had a first meeting with roughly 20 participants accepting, and we'll take the next meeting on a very US unfriendly day, it will be July 4th. So this is just because we wanted to keep the cadence and just find out like what's the communication channel and so on. And it was roughly, let's say, 3 to 4 participants coming from US, and they agreed that they would be fine in taking it another week. And what I also find engaging was that a third of the responses all said we would be piloting something like this. So we would like to really execute things and not just reviewing. So I hope to get this in there. was a limited response on funding with 13%. We had multiple response from single companies also, so therefore overall we have like 3 to 4 companies which showed interest in actually spending money on such an activity. That's where we still need to follow up. We first brought on those which are mainly interested in. We asked also for the challenges, and you could see that a bunch of them came from safety critical space, so that we'll also see in later questions. But what's really interesting was like automating the process to check with conformant, that is a strong challenge, and we really see that automation comes in a lot, and that there's also no standardized approach how to really assess then the projects which you would like to understand and how this then aligns with the safety critical standards. This said, we're not dealing with the safety critical standard alignment here. We really would like to go for quality management idea, like what are best practices, and I think that we haven't said explicitly, we do not want to put additional burden on any maintainer or any open source project. We really just want to write down what is existing. What are open source projects doing? What evidence do they have? Because you enforce so many things with automated checks. You have peer reviews, you have protected branches, you have contribution guidelines, coding guidelines, whatever. They are all existing, and often they're just written down in half a page or so, or spread over some parts in the repo, but nowhere really structured. And we want to collect these kind of things. And of course, also what a big challenge is mentioned is then later on the code size of a project. You can see as a challenge, but you can also say it's not. You can see from the responses, they may think about Linux kernel size or larger OS or so, but you can also treat this on a small library, right? And it doesn't need to be a very complex thing. And this ports to the next point, that there is no uniform architecture. This will be also very challenging because it's very different tools, very different ways, very different kind of documentation. Mailing list or messenger, ISC chat, Matrix, whatever you have where communication is exchanged, the ticketing system, even the kernel is not really unified for the bug handling, right? So you can see that these are all elements, and also that there is no really standard way how to measure quality. And that's why we also wanted to come up with KPIs where you can really measure parts. I think it comes on the later slide, but we also want to interact then with other parts. I know there's OpenSSF scorecard, for example, where you get certain scores, and then there's a Trust with Software framework recently coming where there's also some kind of measuring and evaluation tools. But the thing is that they are not really concentrating on what are the existing best practices. They are considering what are scores, what to evaluate, and then they create KPIs, but not based on what has been established. And there's a bit more on this. I don't want to read it all out, so it's in the handout. What I really found, there was one comment, and I found this was a motivational statement for me. It's like the challenges are that requirements, architecture, and design documents, as well as corresponding impact analysis need to be there. You need to have traceability, and you need to converge, coverage and test reports need to be there. This was on automotive, that's why I kept it. And then there was the twist in the story where it says like, this is in many projects just a matter of reformatting existing data. And that's what we are talking about. We want to reformat this data into a readable approach that you can just simply say, okay, here's the assessment guide. So that's maybe just a small thing to take one step further. And a repeating theme, which was not in this, is really like, it's not clear what quality actually means. And we had multiple discussions in the ELISA project as well, where we then ended up in turning around the circle on what is quality. Therefore, we also talk about a best practices standard in many places, and not always about quality. This was a compromise on this to just talk about best practice, while we ultimately look for like quality part. And yeah, we had still a lot of response, which just came from safety critical domains, so they have been a bit biased. Cool. This was my updated slide, which was not updated, I guess. Yeah, I forgot to save it or something like this. Yeah, what you can see like for important criteria, this was another question on this when you evaluate quality of open source. It's like really the active community behind. What do you have? Is there a community health around this? How is the team set up? How is testing done? Safety certification, of course, was mentioned, but also like popularity of the project. It could be also like for selecting which kind of project you'll take. Is there traceability? Do you have ASPOM generation possibilities, which helps us to also show like what is it about? How do our CVEs handle fixes done? Is the design modular? So there's a lot of these kind of things involved there. And also one key element, which I also like mentioned is the documentation side. On the right side, which is very long text which nobody wants to read, this is the part which goes a lot on the standard side, so that you can really see like what quality, safety, integrity standards asking for. So that's just more, I put it in for reference. What I also took here, I put an extract statement. I found this quite good to start with, like who is backing the project? Like, is it a single vendor? Is it like what risks are in there? Is there really someone backing? Is there a vivid community? How confident can I be the maintenance will continue? It's not directly a quality thing, but it can be additional elements to settle. I mean, if it's a high quality, you can argue and say, well, it stops next week. It still had a good quality, right? But it may be something we need to take into account for the standard. And like, what is when something goes wrong, which gives you into the error handling and the bug fixes and so on, how this is evolving. And just as a starting point, and this can be helpful for us to see like where do we want to go. It's like simple criteria like number of stars, forks, active updates, and so on, that we just focus on very vivid projects and take them as good example, because we can see then they are in an infrastructure which is of use. And most likely it's something where quality also matters in a security field or so on. So now we got an intro, like what we could do with it. We had the update part, or the first part from Gab, where he's talking about the different steps in there, and now it's the time to place it somewhere, right? So it needs to be visible to a lot of people, and therefore give the clicker to Gab shortly.
Okay, so where do we start working to make this happen, right? We have, as I said, actually, we had an initial meeting like last week, I think, where we presented this repository, and soon we'll also have a mailing list. Okay, so if you would like to join this initiative, you can come and have a look at this repo, and we'll have probably a regular meeting, and this is where we'll start doing the work. And
so we should interrupt. I mean, if you don't find further information, if you missed the entry point, you can just simply also create an issue at GitHub or so in the repo, and then we can point you to the information. So it's like whatever you find as an entry point, feel free to. We're watching it regularly.
Yeah.
So
okay, and you can also send a message to the mailing list that that will be created very shortly. So what do we do? First step is to analyze the existing work. So we need to look at the academia articles that already exist, and that kind of document, collect best practices for open source projects, and also we need to analyze what are the KPIs that are defined by such articles. The step number 2 is a sort of very much iterative step. So this is where we want to start evaluating these KPIs against certain pilot projects. Okay, and in the next section of this deck, Philipp will talk about the pilot projects that some examples of pilot projects that we can consider. And so at this stage, basically, we want to validate these KPIs against these pilot projects, and eventually also define new KPIs, because during the evaluation of these pilot projects, we may figure out that there are some practices that were not considered by the standards in the academia, and there could be KPIs associated with these practices. At the end of phase 2, the idea is to come up with a framework and with associated KPIs that can be used to evaluate any open source project. And at this stage, the idea is to evaluate the automation around these KPIs. So are these KPIs suitable to evaluate a continuously evolving project, because at the end of the day, this is the nature of open source, right? Open source, is about having, a continuously evolving code baseline. And indeed, we need to also evaluate the scalability of this framework. Is this really usable to evaluate any open source project, or what we did is only valid for our pilots? Ideally, this is something that we can scale. So, yeah. So these are the proposed phases, and we are at the very beginning now. Okay.
Yeah.
What the hell?
You pressed another button.
Oh.
Okay. So with the starting point at the literature part, and that was already quite an interesting thing to look at. So there is actually a paper out there, the link is also in the slides, on arXiv you can get it. And this was like open source software development process, a systematic review. I mean, what's greater starting point you can get, right? Because it basically tells like where we want to go. So it's like a check, and you can see this approach. They took different search engines, created search requests on this, narrowed them down, had several iterations, and at the end ended up with about 33 different kind of existing papers in literature. This was also like looking first reading the abstracts, reading some details, sorting some things out, then looking into the reference to find something if they've missed something in their search query. So that's like how they narrowed things down. And they also had the approach of looking into the different steps you normally have in development. And here you can see it says as steps requirements, elicitation, or architectural design, coding, testing. And now you would say, what? Because you told me in the beginning it's not the V model, and now we are here again at the V model. If you read through the paper, you can read a lot of things where it shows like equivalence to say, okay, requirements elicitation is something which would be in a process step, but requirements could be anything. And they give examples for projects which are doing work, which handles requirements, but which are not requirement in the way how you know it. It can be bug tickets, it can be patch descriptions, whatever. So this is like, they basically say there is a need for change, and whenever someone wants to add a feature or finds a bug, then it's most likely a requirement. And they bring in evidence in there. And so they go through the different steps. Interesting part is, this is a 2020 study, and it also has a figure in there which shows that the papers go back to the 70s. And a lot of these, even if it's 2020 paper, do not respect any CI or CD practices. And if you look into how you develop open source software today, you will have a lot of CI, CD involvement. You have GitHub actions in there. You do it in the GitLab as well, or you have other, because you want it to be very efficient and do automation wherever you can. You have checks. Here it says you would always review before you run a test, because this is effort. And I mean, nowadays you would most likely say, I let the patch go through my linting and other checks before I actually review it, because the one thing is machine audit and the other one is like manual things. So this is where even the paper already fails and is not up to date, but it gives us a good hint also on projects. Another example which I found was on the thesis, and this was actually going in a safety critical space. It was from a Swedish-US cooperation on the study, and one thing which they were examining was GBOS. I never saw this before, but they actually follow a lot of things on requirements elicitation, and what you could read in there was also that they checked against IEC 61508 as safety integrity standard and ISO 26262. They said there's a good argumentation for the IEC 61508, and then they made something in there, I don't remember exact statement, and I wouldn't never blame the guy who didn't, because it was just like a master thesis on this, but he made a statement on the ISO 26262 and why GBOS would not work for it, and it was basically in the range like, well, yeah, they have not written down requirements in the beginning, so they are not following the V model order. And this was like because he interpreted the ISO as such, which is not valid, but it means like, if you do this, there is relevant data set there, right? We find a lot of evidence in literature, and others have done part of the job, so we just need to write this down and consolidate, and we can therefore back up whatever we have in backing it. But there may be misconceptions. It could be that the people haven't understood the things right, so you don't take it for granted what's in there and really judge it against like what you find as open source projects. And there are far more papers to assess which we need to go on. Like there was just the 31, and then others. Not everything is relevant. I already figured this out. But you also need projects behind it. And you may wonder, like, how close can a project get? And I just took the ROS 2 because it passed by my way, and they actually have a quality guide. And they talk about ensuring code quality. That's a part. And if you go to this, you read this last line, it says static code analysis. Like, that's something which you typically don't do in many projects, right? But the ROS community is close to certification parts, regulated industries, and so on. Right. Another example, I have to bring this because I love Zephyr. There are a lot of things, and they have coding guidelines. They also have the things on the documentation. But, a strong but here, and that's why we have the circle to the beginning. We're talking about, we brought it to Linux Foundation. And these are actually projects which targeting to any way or some way a regulated industry. And this was also something where Gab came up and just said, wait, we need to add another slide because we should also have something in. The most obvious thing, which is not looking directly on the regulated industry, but brings a very huge community base. And therefore, I give the next slide to Gab.
Yeah, so the unreadable slide, but so no, this is just to show, to talk about the Linux guidelines. So probably when we think about Linux, everybody would think, okay, well, this is, a world where developers write code, they send it out to maintainers. If the maintainers like the code is accepted. So there is everything, all the quality gates are just down, to the maintainer acceptance or not acceptance of the code, right? But this is not, this is not fully true. To some extent, if you open the link that you find here at the bottom of this slide, what I'm presenting here, it will come up. You realize that there are effectively, there are process guidelines, on how changes are managed, coding styles, submitting patches, and the stable API, and security bugs, and process management style. So, all of these aspects are in fact very relevant when it comes to code quality. There is something that actually I realized this morning that I missed something here. So there is also the Linux kernel testing guideline that it's part of the official Linux kernel documentation, and it's not reported in this deck. So this is just to mention that we have many quality aspects that are already covered, and in fact some of, like for example, when it comes to the documentation of the code, there is a dedicated page in the Linux kernel documentation that says how you should document your code. And in fact, in ELISA we have also an initiative to write requirements for the Linux kernel that leverage this pre-existing guideline on how to document the code. So just to say that when we think about Linux, many people think a sort of unregulated development that is regulated just by the maintainer's acceptance. This is not fully correct. Okay, so there are guidelines that are followed and that exist today, and that are also documented. Okay, so. And so this is, in summary, this is, we have examples, ROS 2, Zephyr, Linux, to mention some, and these practices are documented, and so we have a foundation, right? We have some pre-existing standard that we looked at. We have some reference projects that we can start from. let's get started, I would say, right?
And for this, we had another workshop. We said started a year back, and we had another workshop this year, again in Lund, and we wanted to challenge it a bit. So we took the ELISA participants, of course, from the safety critical space mainly, where we said like, what kind of literature do you have in mind? Because you may come across, you're in the field of open source, you're in the field of safety, so just bring things in. And I mean, it was just like an ad hoc question. They were not prepared, and I made a slider so that they can just fill in life. So here we got additional things in which we should look at, right? So that was directly, okay, here's something. And this was important because we want to create now a working group, people working on something. And I hope that people came like this because there were many saying, oh, it's one of the another working groups where you just start and all the people come and then everybody listens, nobody's doing anything. Maybe it's also because people don't have work to do and don't know where to start. But we come here and have a list where say, like, start from here. Do you like dig into safety standards? Do you like to dig into literature? Do you want to search for projects? It's like what you bring in, we will put there. So these were just the proposal. And one thing which I completely forgot to mention so far was, we said we write a new standard. Maybe there is already one out there, right? I mean, I'm not the one who's looking through all the standards, but we have also participants, also now in the work group. There was one member, Karen, she said, oh yeah, I'm more or less spending whole my day in kind of standard environments, from the IEC, IEEE, whatever, where it comes to. So this was just like asking the people what kind of standard we may have to look at, right? And there were all these standards already mentioned. And similar, the next one should be maybe taken more, not directly into account, or should be, depending on, so like, what kind of projects could we assess? And there may be some which we need to look at directly or should not, I don't know. Like the EU protocol one, maybe a very specific one and very small one and not with a large community, new, whatever. I don't know if it feels in a research field. It was just from the participants. But of course, also comments like the biggest one or most used project. That's definitely something which you shouldn't take into account. Most likely curl could also be a very good candidate. Linux kernel, of course. You see also Xen project or Zephyr. That's something which I would take potentially out or not taking too much because they already have safety critical in mind. And yeah, that's basically on this. So you see we are in a stage that we can now, we have a working base, we have enough input data which we can work on. We had some support from AI models which also proposed standards which we should look at. This was also not a bad choice. We have literature available, we have a list of standards to assess, we have the working group model in there, and we currently try to have something, first proven things, more details on how the standards look like on until Open Source Summit EU in Amsterdam, so we can showcase some part there. And on top, the things which I mentioned here, like the data on the EU protocol, standards, the articles, the mentioned previous ones on the see this and so on. You find all this in the repo. So that's already now in the populated parts. And by this, we would come to an open discussion for questions. I think we have a few more minutes, so if you come up, if you already want to volunteer, please do so. Wait,
maybe you have a mic.
Do we have a mic?
Yes.
You pick up a mic? Great. Because then the people can hear it.
Thank you.
It's very nice for the virtual audience. The late on. Start over there. This works.
Excellent. So commercial aerospace is going to be your highest degree of rigor. It just doesn't get any more nitpicky than that. But mapping to other degrees of rigor or those things where the analogs would appear in other standards, that way we could come up with abstractions that we say, as long as you meet these, you'll map to these standards and you should be fine.
Right.
That's what we're trying to do.
It's also like what you can see is you can see in the standard how it refers to other standards, how it has evolved, what was taken into account. But I hope really to find something where also modern software development is taken into account with the ICD practices or so on. And I don't know yet what's there around there, but I think also from looking from safety standards, integrity standards, it can be a base to find more standards. Yeah. Will we pass on the mic?
Yeah, I guess my question was, so like way at the beginning, you mentioned one of the things that you wanted to use to evaluate the quality of these software products was actually like user surveying and figuring out like users think that this is a good product, they think it's a good tool, it's useful. I don't know, like, is that like based on other like things that other standards do? Because that really scares me. Like, the open source community or any internet community loves to have big opinions and then loves to dogpile with those opinions and like review bomb things based on, you know, maybe something that's unrelated to the quality of the software. Like this feels actually a little bit scary to me. Like it could be an attack surface to, I don't know, like have a bot network claim that this product really sucks and therefore this company that's relying on it can't actually ship their product.
Yeah, it's a good point. Of course, you can also see it positively if you say, like, that's something which I would like to use, and I see that the KPIs are not fitting. I have a chance to modify something on these KPIs. That's also the approach which, like, the trustable software framework tries a little bit, where they say that's how you come to a score, like a credit score for software. And similar like this one, also for what we are doing here, I would say it should even be also for proprietary software, right? You need to benchmark it against, like say, if I take this standard and I benchmark it and I calculate KPI for it, I should be able, and that's also intention, that I take it for my in-house development. And I'm pretty sure that if you say, you have this always, and we see this in the safety critical space a lot, that they just say, well, you're not complying to the standard, so it's not good. And you may end up in saying, like, I do everything, and you cannot show me that whatever I do is not properly and not sufficient. The only argument left if you have is like, you're not following a standard. And then we're out of the argumentation at the end, right? And therefore we want to fill this. But you're fully right, it could be happening, but in the safety critical space where we are also using this and where we talk about like quality management, the people do not even reach that state. They just say like, it's open source, it's chaos, it's not structured, and that's why we are not even accepting and we are not even considering it and write all the things on our own. And I'm totally convinced that what you write on your own in a small little group has, to 99% most likely, not the sufficient state of quality than what you have in heavily used open source projects due to the rigor of all the activities with reviews and so on which are done. And that is the thing which we want to write down. And maybe it's even, last point, and maybe it's even good that some things are sorted out because there are crappy projects which you may use. So, right, and then it's good to say, like, okay, we have a base.
There is something I want to add is, so, I mean, here we are not trying to scrap, to scrape, the pre-existing quality standards. So the idea here is to look at the different objectives of the, of the standards that you have today that are based on the V model. So what is the objective behind requirement? What is the objective behind, software architecture, right? And low-level design, coding guidelines, right? And then the idea is to define KPIs to ensure how these KPIs meet the same objectives, right? So it will not be like, it's not like a sort of referendum where, we have, we vote and, we say, yeah, this is a good KPI. No, I mean, we need to, the idea is to show, to justify how a certain KPI contribute to meet a specific objective. Right?
Yeah, so. And you should have the chance to also understand the things. So the worst thing which could happen is, and that I sometimes have the feeling, people following a standard, and they believe if they follow the standard, they're done. And making it very concrete, also to a similar extent, there were people asking, like, can I create a safe Linux system, or I want to create a safe Linux project? And I asked them, like, okay, when you want to create such a product, do you have any experience with Linux? No. Do you have any experience in safety? No, but we think it's a good idea to make a product. And said, no, then don't start it. You should bring experience in the subject, and the other one you need to learn. So if you just follow a standard because reading of it, you will not do it correctly, because there is an essence behind. Question over there.
I have a comment and a suggestion. So a year or two ago, one of our quality engineers and I did a survey asking people what they look for as indicators of quality when they're trying to decide whether or not to deploy an open source project. And gave them a lot of different options, and it wasn't a huge survey, it's not statistically significant or anything, but I was very surprised to see that the things that the user said that they looked at as indicators of quality were not what I would have considered indicators of quality. And almost nobody looked to see, what were our test results, or, what our test coverage was, or, so people looked at the user mailing list to kind of gauge if people sounded happy or negative. And they looked at the documentation to see if it was well-written, and not very much else. Anyway, so I just want to echo what the previous speaker said, which is, if you just ask users, it may not be the best place to go. So the other comment I wanted to make, and I'm sure you're aware of this project, it's pretty old, but years ago, David Wheeler put up this best practices badge thing on the internet, and it's like a questionnaire you go through for your project, and it says, how do you ensure this? And you fill in something, and then in most cases they say, give us a URL that we can look at that prove it. And the reason I'm bringing this up, it's probably a bit out of date. It's an old project, but it's still out there. There's got to be a fair amount of data in there where open source projects have already answered, how do I do this? And you can look at this. The thing I like about it is, unlike many of these things that go and score you, it's not a yes/no question. It is, how do you ensure this? And to me, that's just a much more meaningful.
This sounds really great. It's a good approach. And actually, I was not aware of it, so therefore, super helpful.
Oh, well, I think David Wheeler's here. I think he just spoke somewhere yesterday.
Oh.
I mean, he's here today. Anyway, I could show you where it is. I have a couple of those badges, so I know about it.
So I'm a documentation engineer who focuses on quality and accuracy. Have you considered any standards for assessing the quality of the documentation and its accuracy against the product that it's associated with?
No.
Cool, let's talk.
Basically, just from the stage also where we were starting collecting and looking, and just to see, like you mentioned, the standard. So there was something would be in a checklist to bring in. On the contrary side, of course, we need something to look later on for creating the KPIs, but the first step was like we want to write down what are best practices. They need to be properly documented as well, of course. But that's just, there it comes to. And I would say whatever is existing is like a checking against and finding certain items. So it can give a good fit and it can be a good standard to use. But we won't want to take it simply like this, because that's what many other approaches have been there. So not yet considered. If there are certain things to take in, we would put it in the list that we also really have this in mind and assessed it, because the question will come again by someone else or by you, or whoever knows. And that's exactly where we want to have it. And we start with a knowledge base.
Cool, sounds good, thank you.
Great, I guess then we are at the end from the scheduled time, I guess, right? I don't remember exactly, like it's
so
45 minutes, we're done.
Yeah, are you hungry?
Yeah. Then feel free to go for lunch. Thank you so much.